economy that will be most impacted by a no-deal Brexit, and it also amends various provisions of the tax code here to ensure that the provisions which only apply currently if the property or the subject matter of the transaction is EU related, and to extend those provisions to include the UK. So, for example, for agricultural relief purposes, the definition of agricultural property is going to be amended if there is a no-deal Brexit to include the UK in addition to the current provision which restricts it to the EU. So I suppose the outcome, is still very uncertain and changing on a daily basis.
So, Arabella, if we were to assume, that obviously there will be a Brexit, and we're now looking at life post-Brexit, how is the UK going to move from its current rules and standards whereby it's governed by the EU and then to stand alone? I mean, will it adopt any of the EU rules and standards, do you think, or is there any?
I do. I mean, I think most people feel that the English have something of a reputation for being strict and proper and upright and all the rest of it. And I think that there is a genuine pride in the standards that apply to all sectors of society and business life in the UK. I don't see a world in which we radically depart from the current standards which go along with being a member of the EU. Because I think the UK, if you look at sort of, for example, transparency registers, the UK has been at the forefront of the group of countries arguing in favour of transparency registers and particularly those in the public. So that would be one good example of an area where I would very much doubt that we're going to radically change our views and introduce softer regulation. We want, I think, to maintain what's been called synthetic exposure to EU standards, so that even if under some future arrangement we're not obliged to change our laws to match the EU's, I think we certainly would voluntarily do that. You see that with other countries. I mean, a small example is Guernsey and Jersey. Every time Jersey blinks, Guernsey blinks quite quickly afterwards. And I think we would be very, very much like that. So just
to follow on then from that point, I mean, do you think there's any possibility of the UK then becoming sort of a low tax, low regulation jurisdiction and sort of selling itself that way?
I think it is, it's been put forward as sort of one interpretation of what it means to be released from the obligation to continue with the EU regulations, but I think it's a mischievous interpretation. Yes, it could happen. If we are no longer obliged to introduce EU legislation, then we could. But in reality, again, going hand in hand with our view of ourselves as world leaders in terms of standards of regulation, I don't think that would happen, and I think we're very unlikely to become the Cook Islands. I don't think we can afford to. Some people who are in the running for the Conservative leadership have a tax cutting agenda, but I don't think anybody thinks we can afford to cut tax all the way back.
I suppose staying with tax, and Alberto, you mentioned that there are obviously a significant number of UK citizens living in Spain who are non-resident, and I understand in Spain for inheritance tax purposes there's a difference between residents and non-residents are treated differently, and maybe Spain has had its hand slapped a little in respect of that. Is that fair to say?
Very much so, yes, because they were not very happy non-residents, I have to say, with the tax situation. I mean, if one thing I would like all of you to take away from here is that when you look at Spain, it's not only one, in fact there are 17 of them, because Spain is arranged in 17 different regions, and each of them have different statutory heirs and different inheritance taxes to be applied. So there are 17 of them plus the general system. So what happens is that the local system will granting benefits to the residents in that particular areas, but the non-residents will fall under the general system, which is not very generous. Because basically what happens is a lot of autonomous communities, which is the name of these regions, have completely dismissed the inheritance tax. So So the difference will be 10,000 of them.
Okay.
So you will be living in the same region. If you were a non-resident, you would be taxed 100,000, 400,000,
Right.
and your next neighbor was resident for that.
Penny.
Sorry.
No, but
So we're taking two
okay.
votes, but you can probably say no, this has to change.
The EU doesn't like that, yeah, treating people differently.
No, and the thing is going beyond that, because now apparently what has happened is the Supreme Court was taking because the discrimination of free movement of capitals could not be applied to non-EU members also.
Oh, sure, okay.
So what is happening is that in fact there is a decision already taken that even non-EU members will benefit from the system. So it might be the case that
Okay.
from tax purposes, from inheritance tax purposes, even Brexit will not have that many implications.
Okay.
Of course, the revenue doesn't want to make it clear because there are 4 years to claim back from the revenue.
Oh,
So
of
the
course.
whole situation is very much standby. Well, we will see what happens with
Yeah,
this decision.
yeah, exactly, I can imagine. And Tracy, staying then with the residence theme, I suppose, do you think there are any advantages or anything that Ireland can take advantage of, as particularly, I suppose, I'm thinking in relation to the non-dom regime we have, and do you think there's anything that, you know, a sort of unique selling point, I suppose, that we could take advantage of there?
Yeah, I certainly over the last kind of 18 months, we've certainly seen an increase in private clients who are resident abroad considering Ireland as a jurisdiction in which they might consider establishing residence. And I suppose the Irish non-dom regime is very beneficial in that regard, in that if you're Irish resident and non-domiciled, you're only liable to tax in Ireland on your Irish source income and foreign income to the extent you remit it into Ireland. And similarly for gains on specified assets, and then foreign gains to the extent that you remit them in. And unlike in the UK, we don't have a charge to avail of the remittance basis, nor do we have any deemed domicile rules which are currently applicable in the UK. So it can be very attractive for an individual who's looking and considering their options in the UK. And we certainly have 3 or 4 clients at the moment in that space looking to take up residency in Ireland. I suppose in doing so, it's very important that they would plan ahead, and it's generally taking about 18 months, you know, to go through that process of planning to get somebody ready for moving to Ireland, and particularly when they're coming from the UK, and looking at the residency rules in the UK and making sure that they have lost their residency in the UK to become resident in Ireland can be tricky. Our Irish residency rules are quite straightforward. There's no statutory-based test on the number of days you're present here. The UK system is far more complicated in terms of the various tests you apply and the ties that are available to I suppose minimise the amount of days you can spend in the UK and be deemed resident there. So that can be very crucial for clients, particularly when they're coming from the UK to take up residency here. I guess just to give you a practical example, one client who's moving and had rented his property in the UK, had rented a property in Ireland, was establishing his residency here, and was going back to the UK on an ad hoc basis, but well within the days. And we had to consider with the UK advisor whether the hotel he was staying in when he went back to the UK, they should be staying in the same hotel every time he went back, because the accommodation tie in the UK is that specific that if you are using the same hotel on a regular basis, that it could be seen as accommodation available for your use. So there's a lot of, I suppose, practical concerns in making sure someone becomes not only resident in Ireland, but loses their residence in the UK. There's lots of practical issues around, I suppose, looking at the client's portfolio and making sure that they have hidden capital, so we separate out their income and capital before they would come to Ireland. Things like if they have offshore structures in corporates or trusts, that you're happy that before they make the move that they're not going to fall within the little complicated anti-avoidance that we have in relation to offshore structures. So restructuring can often be necessary in advance of any move here. Things like will they dispose of property before they come so that they can remit in clean capital, and what kind of offshore funds does the client have, depending on the nature of what they've invested in. Some of them will qualify for the remittance basis, some will not. And then I suppose practical issues, non-tax considerations, like where will they live, where will the kids go to school, have they thought about renting or buying, or will there be visa applications necessary? All of those things are very practical considerations, but it's certainly something that I think is a positive for Ireland in the context of Brexit, and something we've seen a good bit of in recent months, where people are considering a move, particularly where they can avail of a non-long regime.
Some work there, obviously. If I can kind of change tack a little and talk about something I think that will interest us, and is that sort of, as I mentioned earlier, the difference between the common law regime and the civil law regime. And I think, certainly personally, I wouldn't have a lot of exposure to the civil law, or none really, exposure to the civil law regime. And I think our audience would be very interested to hear a little bit about that from you, Alberto. I suppose, in particular, for example, as trust and estate practitioners, I understand in Spain there isn't really trusts. Is that a fair thing to say, or?
No, not at all. There is no legal entity that remotely is similar to trust. Whatever they tell you, there's none. Some people say, the foundations maybe, but it really is not. And it's not only that, it's the mentality of professionals and the mentality of the public. They do not use trust, and they are not used to that. And also the mentality of the tax authorities, which basically go through the trust and completely disregard.
Sure.
So if you look at the outcome of the inquiries and the tax inspections regarding to trust, they're very, 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 very brutal. You are the beneficiary, and that's when there is.
So it's always a look-through vehicle.
You have to be extremely careful. I mean, it is a real problem. Not only from the basic point of view, when you are winding up a estate, you cannot register the trustee as the owner, because if you do that, then he will have a statutory right, so it will be the sons of the trustees who will be beneficiary of the property. The taxation from the trustee to the real beneficiaries will be taxable.
If you name someone as a trustee, they almost become the actual owner as opposed to just a legal owner.
In Spain, we completely disregard the trustee as such, so he will appear to formalize the documents, but the registration should take place directly into the name of the beneficiaries at all times. Thank God in Spain we don't have to name an administrator, so it doesn't really become a problem, but it really translates very, very, very badly. And in terms of ownership of this position, there is also no infrastructure for it. There's no Spanish company that deal with it. And to try to explain to a Spanish national that you are going to leave everything in the hands of someone else who's going to administer it when you get out, it might be quite a lengthy procedure.
Okay. And obviously you mentioned that the Spanish are very proud Europeans and adopt so many of the European regulations.
Yes,
maybe England and Ireland, or the UK and Ireland probably less so.
I think that's the real problem. I mean, Brexit is going to be a problem, but in terms of succession, the main problem is that basically you have opted out, and that is going to put England in a very peculiar situation, because British nationals who become resident in Spain are going to suffer the consequences of the regulation with the succession regulation and with the economic regime regulation. So anybody who takes up residence or any clients you may have considering moving to Spain, you are going to have to give a very specific and clear advice as to what the implications are if they get they are considered under the European law habitual person. And I think that's going to be a problem for Italy. It's not going to influence at all any of these concepts, which are concepts that are going to be created at a European level. It's not for each country to decide what habitual residence is. It's for the European Court of Justice, or into modeling all these kind of concepts that are going to be very relevant in the going to be started. We have the problem now in Spain, because when you try to establish habitual residency, where someone, for example, an English person or an Irish person who spends 6 months in Spain and 6 months here, what is habitual residence? An habitual residence determines the law applicable.
Yeah.
So if you're Irish or English, if you are considered habitual resident in Spain, then the statutory legacies will apply if you have assets in Spain. So it's complicated, and I think that's the real Brexit succession purposes, that they have opted out of the regulations regarding succession.
Irrespective of Brexit.
I mean,
that was going to be an issue even if they stayed, essentially.
Yes, that was going to be. I mean, for example, in other areas, family law is going to be completely traumatic, because you were signatories to the and all the problems. I mean, we all know the difference between getting divorced in Lisbon or getting divorced in Madrid. The difference might be millions of pounds.
Sure.
And that was a structure. The one who was going to file first was going to get the jurisdiction.
Okay.
But now it's going to be uncertainty. It's going to be litigation pending, and each court is going to have to decide which is the competent one. And English jurisdiction is very greedy. And Spaniards don't want any more work. Spanish judges say that is for England. So it is going to be a good fun ride.
And just going back to the succession regulation, and just a really fundamental issue. I mean, even if you don't live in Spain, or you might have assets in Spain, and then this whole issue about whether you should have a will everywhere you have assets. I mean, I'd really appreciate if there's each of the panel's views on whether you should have a will in every country that you have an asset, or what do you think?
Well, I think so much of the reluctant bride aspect that Alberto was talking about is the fact that the UK has always had a very different approach to much of Europe, whether it's because it's common law or whether it's because it's an island and historically used to welcoming people from all sorts of different places. We've always had an extremely Catholic approach to, small c Catholic, approach to how people leave their assets, what people choose to do, and so essentially, as most of you will know, the UK basically says you can make a will under any law that seems applicable. You can have more than one will if you want it. We don't have forced heirship. The only thing we have is a general obligation to continue looking after those who are dependent on you. And that is it. And so when the judge this morning was talking about section 117, I was fascinated because this sort of is a concept that it doesn't exist, at least certainly not in statute in the UK. So I think from the UK's perspective, you will understand therefore why we don't want to accept the rules, or there wasn't an obvious logic to the UK deciding to accept succession directive, for example. And therefore, we've arguably always been a third country, therefore arguably Brexit changes nothing. We will still say, if you turn up with 6 wills governing assets in different countries, and even though you're habitually resident in the UK, you've decided to make a will under the law of Spain because that's where you come from, we'll accept all of those things. That's absolutely fine by us.
Yeah, I suppose we're kind of sitting on the fence. We opted out of the succession regulation as well. And I suppose the general advice in Ireland before the succession regulation was if you had a real property located in a foreign jurisdiction, that you should have a specific will in that jurisdiction dealing with it. And I suppose after the succession regulation, the advice is similar but a little more nuanced, in that I suppose the advice now is to get local advice to confirm that your Irish will can deal with the property. So if you have a property in Spain or in Portugal or anywhere in Europe where they are a signatory to the EU succession regulations, that you will get Spanish or Portuguese advice confirming that your Irish will can deal with that property effectively. And I suppose to bear in mind that the succession regulation doesn't deal with tax issues, so local tax advice is always very important. And as well to look at the nature of your Irish will. If you're creating a trust under that will, that won't be recognised in Spain, even if you could use the nationality provisions under the regulation. So I suppose the advice is still the same, that you need foreign advice to confirm the Irish position.
Berto, what's the position in Spain then?
I mean, 1 or 2 wheels, that's the 1 million question, basically. I think it depends very much, varies in each particular situation. I think it's very important to consider who is the entity that is going to be considered in that document. The Spaniards are completely obsessed with the idea of statutory legacies, and for that purpose they need to have a full view of the succession.
Okay.
So if there are 2 wills and there's an English investor feeling very uncomfortable and going to get trouble. On the other hand, it's much more efficient if you have 2 wills in terms of building up the state and register and verification. But definitely any clients you have that are English or Irish nationals, they should really make a choice of law. That's very, very important. In 1 will, 2 wills, that's many. But that is very, very important because that will avoid the renewal and basically will be able to follow English law as such. And if there is property, it's also interesting to make provisions for the trustee or the individual that will be liaising with the payment of the taxes in the country where the price. Because in Spain and the continent, most of the parts of the continent, the taxes are paid by the beneficiaries directly. So sometimes for trustees that's for problems. Choice of law clause, definitely 1 will, 2 wills, depending on the circumstances, really does look at each specific case.
So
So our 3 lawyers are saying get legal advices.
Yes, self-promoting,
Jurisdiction,
self-promoting.
yeah. It makes sense. And just to look at some of the other areas, Alberto, where there's this distinction between Spanish law and sort of more criminal jurisdictions. You mentioned that there's no need to have administrators to administer the will. Is that correct? How does that work then? How do you administer a will?
It's quite funny, no, we're so close and we're so different.
Yeah.
But basically, you left everything in the hands of the beneficiaries.
Okay.
There is no grant of letters
They
of
just grab
administration.
their own.
They just appear before a notary public. In Spain, to do anything, you have to go to a notary public. And they have civil servants, have private individuals, and they are the holders of public faith. So whatever happens before them cannot be challenged for a court of law, more or less. So basically, they appear there and they sort out the state. If there is not a problem, everything goes through, and there is any problem with the litigation. But the beneficiaries are responsible, each of them, for the assessment of payment of each of the taxes and for sorting out the state.
Okay.
Sometimes it's a problem because one of the beneficiaries can create problems and then
Yeah.
it's stopped. Generally speaking, the system works well.
And if
in that
there's
sense.
a difficulty, can they make a court application or if they have any questions?
Yes, I mean the
Yeah.
flexibility is there and there can be early arrangements.
Yeah.
But also there's little room for operating because we have statutory legacies. So in that sense, it makes sense. The administration job is not that big
Okay. Yeah.
in the sense that everything is very much settled by the statutory rights or implemented by wills.
The rules are very prescriptive then. As to
It is
what
not,
is
it's, of course, that's what, I think that's the reason why the administrator is not so much a figure that has evolved in that way.
Yeah. And I think another area that differs is that you don't have lasting power of attorney.
Well, it has been introduced for the first time in 2003. It's not used at all. And people feel very distressful at all. I think Spain is very much a country where you have the grandmother at home and everybody takes care of one thing and the other. And the whole thing is very much done in the normal way of things. So that to appear before a notary public and grant, you have to go to a notary public, of course, to appoint someone. It's not really have taken on yet. It is really something quite curious. And I have problems enforcing the enduring powers
Really?
from other jurisdictions because you have to do an affidavit of law to submit to the court explaining what the situation is.
And so say Granny loses her capacity, I mean, who has control over Granny's bank accounts?
Well,
then?
it takes a long time before a Spanish granny loses the And then, when she dies, the account is empty before she goes to Maria.
Fair enough.
It's going
fair
like
enough,
that.
Yeah. Okay, informal then, an informal attorney. Okay, so moving on then to the more fundamental EU principles, or we all remember our 4 pillars from college, but I suppose, Tracy, just starting with you, one of the important things, even from a personal level for everybody, is the free movement of people and the ability of people to move. What are your thoughts on that and what's going to happen?
I suppose there's been some clarity, I suppose, last week, clarity in a Brexit context, I suppose, in relation to the free movement of people and the rights that citizens in Ireland and the UK will have in a potentially post-Brexit environment. With the memorandum of understanding that was signed by the Irish and UK governments last week. And under it, essentially, it recognised, I suppose, the common travel area that exists between both our jurisdictions since 1923, I think. And I suppose the close ties that exist between both jurisdictions. And essentially, while it's not legally binding, both the Irish and UK governments acknowledge the common travel area and acknowledge that they would like to continue to grant the rights that currently exist between our jurisdictions and that will continue post-Brexit. So that for issues like the right to travel across the border and mutual recognition of qualifications, the right to work, to access healthcare in each jurisdiction, to vote, that all of those rights will be maintained post-Brexit. Now it is a memorandum of understanding, it's not legally binding, but I suppose it's a good indication of how Ireland and the UK would like things to progress going forward, and that hopefully there will be a bilateral agreement in the future confirming that. Because I suppose we don't want to be in a position where you need a visa to go to the UK, especially if you're just literally crossing the border.
Yeah. Well,
Arabella, have you any?
Yeah, I think the day that a visa is required for an Irish person to enter the UK would be the day that everybody says that's enough.
Yeah.
So, when they talk about special relationships, much overused in international diplomatic circles, but the UK-Ireland relationship really is a special relationship, and that has to be preserved in all its many ways. And I think, so post-Brexit, assuming Brexit actually does happen, but post-Brexit, Irish people will still be able to come and live and work in the UK and do all of the things that have been possible until now, and presumably British people going the other way. Spanish people, on the other hand, there may not be much incidence of people choosing to move to Blackpool or Brighton because of the British weather, but unlike people moving to Spain. But I think clearly lots of people do move from Spain or the rest of the EU to the UK mainly to work. As I say, I think not very many retirees, but that will is that until now I've been saying nothing changes. That I think will change a bit. If they're already there on the day that Brexit happens, then it's very clear that even unilaterally the UK is going to say, you stay, you can bring your relatives, and situation absolutely normal. But for anybody who's not already there on Brexit Day, essentially going forward, the EU is going to be treated, with the exception of Ireland, the same as the rest of the world. So in order to come to the UK, you have to fit into one of a number of small number of categories. So it's basically student, employee, entrepreneur, or investor. And so in order to come and live in the UK, people will have to fit into one of those. But I think by and large, the practical difference is going to be for most EU people, they will still be able to come to the UK if they want to. The practical difference is they have to find a job before they come, rather than coming to the UK and then finding a job.
3 years ago, I met my first real-life Brexiteer when I was over in London before the referendum, and he was what seems to be now a typical Brexiteer, in that he was a gentleman in his 60s who told me he had just exercised his postal vote because he wasn't going to be around for the referendum, because of course he was going to be in his holiday home in Spain. And then what's going to happen to all these British people in Spain, Albert? Are you going to...
Right, okay, I suppose will be reciprocal. The same arrangements that have been made here for the people who are already in Spain will apply. I mean, the battle has become quite nasty, because at the risk of the withdrawal without an agreement, they have to sort out the situation of the English who are already habitually resident there. So they produce a form in order to pass the approval, and in the form, I think Gibraltar was described as an overseas territory, and the Spanish government demanded that the form was changed and appears as a British colony. So passions are running high and they won the battle, so now it is a British colony in the official form. So I think that's going to be quite one of the most traumatic aspects, because there are a lot of Spaniards, I mean, they don't come here for the sunshine, that is true, but they come here to work. I mean, I was in the hospital the other day, nothing too serious, but I love it. It was full of Spaniards, really, really the most fabulous nurses. So I think it's going to be quite a hard issue. I am very old, so when I started working in the UK, Spain was not a member of the European Community, and I remember to come to work into the UK required basically an application for the company, and it's quite restricted. I suppose that freedom of movement is not.
Robert too. And then I suppose moving on then to our post-Brexit world, and Ireland being the last Commonwealth country within the EU, and obviously we always had a really close allegiance within the EU with the UK, but now we're going to have to realign, and as I mentioned earlier, even our own committee is considering that, and how we need to be more involved in Step Europe than we perhaps would have been before. So what kind of opportunities do you think are available now in Ireland post-Brexit, or will be available?
I suppose Brexit is going to present huge challenges to Ireland, but with that also comes huge opportunities. And I guess as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing a lot of British citizens deciding to take up residency in Ireland and avail of the non-dom regime. And we're also seeing businesses set up parallel structures in Ireland, really to deal with the Brexit scenario. and also, I suppose, businesses establishing European hubs here. Like last week, he had a client in the office who, and I think he kind of represents, I suppose, where I see the opportunity for Ireland in a post-Brexit scenario. Like he'd done very well in the UK, he was in the IT sector and had significant wealth and had a new business idea. He developed an IT solution within his own business, and he now is selling naturally within the UK, but he realises that it's a very scalable idea and wants to sell it in the EU and ultimately in the US. So he's looking for a European hub to establish his business, and he's looking at Ireland as that jurisdiction because of the tech sector credentials we have, because of the knowledge development box tax credits that are available, and because I suppose the close ties, culturally and socially that we have with the UK, that it's a very comfortable jurisdiction in which to do business. And then I suppose from a personal perspective, he's looking at moving to Ireland and becoming Irish resident and availing of the remittance basis while he is setting up that business in the kind of next 3 to 5 years. So I suppose people like that present a huge opportunity for the Irish economy to develop out the knowledge-based economy and grow those sectors of business which are supported, I suppose, both by the tax environment, commercially and personally. So that represents huge opportunities, I think, for us. And we're also seeing a growth in the movement of certain family offices where they would have significant presence in the UK, and they're looking to establish a sub-office in Ireland, or looking at Ireland as an alternative jurisdiction.
The last word.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, actually, I think that the opportunities for Ireland are amazing I particularly do look after sort of the ultra-high net worth international families, and I think a lot of what happens in the UK now, as a matter of course, it's a well-regulated, politically stable jurisdiction. Those things are actually, those truths are being challenged, and I think therefore not only the fact that Ireland has the remittance basis, but a true version of the remittance basis, unlike Italy, for example, but also the fact that you are remaining part of the EU and therefore within the regulatory sort of envelope. It makes such a huge difference. I've got one family in particular who have established a family office in Ireland, not to do the substance of what they do on a day-to-day basis, which will be carried out still in London, but this is to do with regulated activity. This is a very unusual regulated family office, which happens in a very sophisticated family where they're investing in lots of funds, for example, and they need to be regulated in order then to deal with those people without having to provide KYC for every underlying member of the family. So the big family offices, the ones that matter, the sort of work that you actually want to have, is coming to Ireland already. Why would you not? And there will be more of that. A conversation I was having in the office with one of my colleagues the other day, she said she's got a family who are looking at setting up a private trust company in Ireland. At the moment, the challenge with that is that Irish tax and regulatory requirements, as I understand it, don't specifically have set rules for private trust companies, so they'd be a bit groundbreaking. But assuming that changes and that the Irish tax authorities are broadly welcoming to private trust companies, again, there are quite a lot of circumstances in which families would want their private trustee to be here. There is, as well as the threat of Brexit, if you talk to any of my clients or the sort of people that we talk to every day from our office in London, the thing that worries them most, and they raise it 100 times, as opposed to, let's say 10 conversations about Brexit, 100 conversations about Jeremy Corbyn. And this is the area where you guys are actually going to benefit hugely. If there is a perceived risk, and there really is a very significant perceived risk of a government led by Jeremy Corbyn and all his allies coming in within the next couple of years, well, we know what they're announcing. They haven't announced a lot, but we know that their policies are, the morning after the election, they would introduce exchange controls. I mean, we haven't been there since 1978. Punitive levels of taxation, you can assume that the remittance basis would go immediately. And they're talking about renationalising private companies. So that's basically the state expropriating assets. And they may or may not pay for it, but nonetheless, that is, again, a move that you don't normally see in developed Western economies. And what is going to be the result of that? Well, anybody who's a non-dom and can move is likely to be looking at what their options are. And higher earners, entrepreneurs, those who are making money in the UK and doing fun, interesting, exciting stuff that is producing money for the economy, are likely to have a think about whether they can be doing the same thing somewhere else. So for all of those reasons, I think in some ways Brexit has nothing to do with Corbyn, but Brexit would open the door to Corbyn if there's going to be an open door for him. And that's the real opportunity for everyone sitting in this room, is ironically, is a sort of indirect development post-Brexit rather than a direct consequence.
Yeah.
Comments from our panel before we maybe open it to the floor? No? Okay, well, we're going to have a question and answer session now, but you're also free to ask questions of our earlier speakers. So we had Porrick speaking on AML, and we had Jim, his very interesting presentation on how much money we all should have. So if anyone has any questions, please do speak now. And of course, any questions for our panel here as well.
Just make a comment in relation to the non-dom situation, is that you have an interesting facet in our capital acquisitions tax code, where you're deemed non-resident, even if you are resident, you're deemed non-resident for tax purposes. You haven't been domiciled in the previous 5 years in Ireland.
That can be very beneficial for clients. It gives, I suppose, huge opportunities for planning where a non-domiciled individual is considering the move, because you're correct that there is a special regime that you only become or treated as resident or ordinarily resident if you've been here for 5 consecutive tax years. And that's something actually that comes up a lot with clients who are moving, because while they might be familiar with the remittance basis, because it's similar to what used to apply in the UK, the inheritance tax situation is radically different. So often part of your planning with the client who's moving to Ireland would involve CAT, whether they would make gifts prior to coming or make gifts within the 5-year window, or alternatively some clients would plan to be non-resident one of the 5 years so that they never become Irish resident for CAT purposes when there's a gift or inheritance of non-Irish into your property. It's very good.
Tina just has a microphone here.
It's actually possibly a question for Corey on the area where the beneficial ownership register and data protection meet, not on a sort of theoretical or even ethical basis, but just on the technical basis, because we're trustees and in the midst of doing beneficial ownership registers, and you might start with something you think is very straightforward, but of course when you dig in, it is anything but straightforward. But you might end up with people on your register who you've never heard of before, but who certainly never heard of you. But does that mean, and they might be in far-flung places in the world, nothing to do with us, nothing to do with the trust, really, no beneficial interest whatsoever, but because of the way it's structured, would we then be obliged to serve them with privacy notices, for example?
Insofar as that question goes to the GDPR issues, I'm going to say not one for me, I'm afraid. Apologies for that. I do think it's, the point you make is a very important one, and this part I think goes to the question that Frank asked earlier this morning about the responsibility of trustees in relation to a beneficial class, because there's clearly a responsibility of the trustees to know the persons or the identity of the persons who are in the beneficial class. But it is not, in my view, necessary to verify the identity of all of those persons, particularly those who have not benefited, but may at some point in the future benefit by way of an exercise of discretion. And I think, you know, the impact between the AML obligations and GDPR responsibilities is going to be a very difficult issue to navigate. And, you know, I've been involved in some cases where individuals were contacted for verification of identity information, which came as a huge surprise to them, and they eventually became claimants against trust funds they hadn't even known they were in any remote way associated with. So tread with care would be my observation on that.
This is an observation. I'd be interested in the views of the panel and others here. I think one of the biggest issues for us in STEP Ireland is in the context of Brexit, that we're losing basically our best friends from a knowledge perspective, and on issues like GDPR and beneficial registers of trust. And certainly, I think one of the huge benefits of our involvement in STEP with issues that come up from a common law perspective is that we do have best friends who understand what our issues are. And I think that's going to be a massive issue, and I'm not quite sure how we're going to tackle it, and indeed have STEP thought about it. So it's just, I don't know if anyone has any comments on that.
I completely agree. I mean, the UK have been our biggest ally in mirroring our systems, both common law jurisdictions, both opted out of the succession regulation and kind of, I understand, negotiate together really in the EU. And I suppose from a STEP perspective, we're trying, as Gráinne mentioned, to become more involved in STEP Europe. Make new friends. and I suppose grow in that way, because we will need new allies in the EU if Brexit does happen.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm looking around for sort of STEP global. But yeah, exactly. And I mean, presumably STEP will continue to support STEP Ireland, and if necessary, help in providing technical feedback on
yes,
developments.
it's a bit like the common travel area. I don't see any of that particularly changing. I think we just need to be more aware of it, and certainly the focus at the board level has been around the global issues, which then feed into individual issues such as the UK, Ireland, Brexit, common law. I honestly don't see any of that changing, but it's certainly the board are very much aligned.
This is obviously something as well that may play a big part in our Congress next July.
Well, that was part of the reason for it coming to Dublin. So to that extent, it's very much on the radar.
Just to add, from a public policy perspective, since the Article 50 arrangement was triggered by the UK, there's been increased focus, certainly from a public policy perspective, on trying to, I suppose, gain alignment with jurisdictions like Malta and Cyprus, which are common law jurisdictions. Certainly Cyprus is, and Malta has a lot of common law type principles around trust, but I think Nora's point is well made. Trusts are viewed quite negatively, I think, probably unfairly in some respects by regulators, and we're certainly going to have to work harder to try and refute some of the dissemination of information in public. So that is going to be a challenge for us, but I think with STEP as an umbrella body, we're actually in a much stronger position to exercise whatever influence we can in that area.
I think STEP is already worried about this, and the European chapter is creating the public policy committee, which will be dealing basically with with these aspects that are going to be a bit left alone for the civil law countries. So Ireland has to play a massive role on that because we're going to need you, and the idea is basically lobbying as much as possible for certain structures to be there.
Harry, just go back to a more technical work, I'm afraid. On the AML and the body corporate register, where do you see family partnerships sitting in all of that? Do you see that they're going to be also in as other legal entities under the body corporate register?
Register, as I understand it, only applies to companies that are established in Ireland. There is a reference in my paper somewhere to other, mainly civil law entities used by families, which are covered by the Fifth Directive, but are not, to my mind, subject either of the regulations on companies or trusts which have been adopted. So I don't see them as actually covered insofar as the registers are concerned.
Then the same with joint ownership, we're not going to have to be concerned with the joint ownership, such as with partnerships, the joint ownership, we're not going to have that difficulty. Compared to, for instance, with the states, they have said specifically there's the express trust, and therefore it's caught under the trust, even if it's an absolute beneficiaries. But we're not going to have a sense of a trust structure over the holding of property jointly or in partnership.
I think if we're talking about property which is jointly owned, either on a bare trust, that is certainly covered by the trust register arrangements, and a trust register is required to be maintained in that regard. I know this was an issue that was the focus of a lot of pushback by STEP, because a lot of family members hold property on bare trust arrangements for reasons that really have nothing to do with tax. But those arrangements are all covered by the Fifth Directive and by the requirement to maintain a beneficial ownership register. If the assets are not held